What will Russia do once the war in Ukraine comes to an end? Will Putin cut his losses and consolidate his hold in the east? Or will the win give him enough confidence to directly confront NATO? We'll answer this and more by diving into the mind of Russia's dictator and analyzing his recent actions to predict what the madman will do if the end of this conflict ever comes to pass. Before we can accurately predict what might happen when the Russian and Ukrainian war ends, we need to look at how the war is going after over 2 years of the conflict. No one can forget how on February 24, 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin launched an unexpected and completely unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. This kicked off the largest armed conflict that Europe has seen since World War II. Today, as the fighting continues, casualties mount, and the humanitarian crisis worsens, the whole world is wondering just how the conflict will evolve in 2024, if a negotiated settlement is possible, and if so, what are the potential implications of such an agreement? Above all, how will the West continue to hold Putin accountable while mitigating the risks of a wider war between Russia and NATO? Ever since Russia invaded Ukraine, and perhaps even before that, Putin has dreamt of gaining control over Ukraine and building Russia back up to its Cold War power. But in the past 2 years, Russia has failed to capture Kyiv, take control of the Ukrainian government, or stifle the spirit of the Ukrainian people. The scale of Putin's blunder is especially stark today, said Secretary of Defense Lloyd J. Austin III in a statement last month. The Kremlin's forces failed to win the Battle of Kyiv, failed to topple Ukraine's democratically elected government, and failed to crush the will of the Ukrainian. It's safe to say that Putin's hubris was boosted by his misplaced confidence in the strength of the Russian military forces and intelligence reports. This was understandable, considering that many countries, including the United States, felt that Ukraine and President Zelensky's government would never hold up against the Russian military forces. Both of these calculations proved to be incorrect. Much to the surprise of both Russia and the West, Ukraine has had far more success than expected. Ukrainian troops have retaken more than half of the sovereign territory that was grabbed by the Kremlin forces in 2022. Additionally, in the past 2 years, Russia has suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties, lost significant equipment, and severely set back its military morale and confidence. A declassified U.S. intelligence report from earlier this year assessed that the war has cost Russia at least 315,000 casualties, about 50,000 of those being deaths, or nearly 90% of the personnel it had when the conflict began. The report also assessed that Moscow's losses in personnel and armored vehicles to Ukraine's military have set back Russia's military modernization effort by 18 years. So how Russia fares in the war and what it might do after the war could very well rest on how much funding and support Ukraine receives in the upcoming months and throughout the rest of the year. Much of the trajectory of the Russian-Ukrainian war will be dictated thousands of miles away in the U.S., as America has been the largest single donor to Ukraine since the invasion started. Ongoing funding for Ukraine is far from secure in 2024, and much of it depends on the winner of the U.S. presidential election in November. The world will be watching closely as U.S. President Joe Biden squares off with former U.S. President Donald Trump, the latter of whom has cultivated close relations with Russia and Putin. The outcome of the election could herald a seismic change in the attitude toward and support for Kyiv. According to the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, the United States has provided approximately $44.2 billion in military assistance to Ukraine since Russia's invasion in February 2022, and more than $47 billion in military assistance since 2014. This assistance includes cash, military supplies, machinery, food, and other humanitarian supplies. The U.S. has also provided 21 air surveillance radars, more than 2 million 155mm artillery shells, long-range missiles, and Abrams tanks, and agreed to donate a fleet of its impressive F-16 fighter jets. There are concerns from the Western world that given Trump's previous good relations with Moscow and America First policy, aid for Ukraine could decrease or dry up altogether if he returns to the White House. For his part, Trump has said that he'd be able to resolve the Ukraine war in one day if he was re-elected, stressing that he would be able to convince the leaders of Ukraine and Russia to make a deal. However, Trump never specified exactly how he would achieve this or what conditions would be laid out in the peace deal. And if the war is over and a peace treaty is signed, will Russia respect the conditions of the agreement? Moreover, even if Putin leaves Ukraine alone, will the confidence of this win bolster his morale and lead to him attacking another European country? Putin, despite steadily losing support from the Russian people since the war started, recently cruised to victory in March's election, winning a fifth term as president. It probably goes without saying, though, that this election, like nearly all of Russia's most recent elections, was hardly a democratic affair. Russia's war in Ukraine has accelerated the process of ruthless consolidation of power in the Kremlin. Putin's regime, with a mixture of fear and confidence, is becoming more brazenly aggressive against any opposition. It's no surprise that the Kremlin is tightly controlling who will compete against Putin. In this past election, they allowed just one candidate to express any anti-war position. This was craftily done to show that by the anti-war candidate losing, citizens supported the war, and that they in turn stood ardently in support of Putin. This did, however, backfire slightly when the opposing candidate Boris Nadezhdin gained a surprisingly large amount of support. Crowds of people stood in long lines throughout Russia to sign petitions to support him. Subsequently, the Central Election Commission refused to register him. It's safe to say that the war appears to have removed many limits on Putin's actions. The presidential election put this on full display. While earlier in his presidency, Putin maintained the veneer of managed democracy or Russian-style sovereign democracy by allowing staged and controlled opposition, the Kremlin is now tightening state control over almost all forms of expression. For example, when opposition leader Alexei Navalny died in prison in February 2024 while serving a 3-decade sentence, police rounded up and arrested those who came out in protest to speak out against the war or the Kremlin. With increasing control and power, Russia could feel emboldened to invade other nations following the end of the conflict with Ukraine. Whatever Russia decides to do, they'll first have to rebuild their economy before even thinking of invading another country. Much of this is due to the sanctions placed on Russia by the Western world, and while the threat of such measures was not enough to deter Putin from launching more attacks, it certainly has hurt Russia's economy. We know that restrictions on exports to Russia have led to decreased production in many industrial sectors. The price cap on seaborne oil imported from Russia, a sanction that dates back to the end of 2022, has had a large negative effect on the country's federal tax revenue. This is very significant, as up to 40% of Russia's federal tax revenue came from the energy sector before the war. So the Western economic sanctions and punishments seem effective, but did they work in practice? Immediately after the invasion began 2 years ago, Russia came very close to a full-blown financial crisis. The external value of Russia's ruble dropped by approximately 30% in just a few days, and Russians swiftly began withdrawing money from their banks. The international community is hoping that by limiting Russia's access to international financial instruments, it'll make it impossible to continue the war in Ukraine and prevent them from waging war on other nations. The Council on Foreign Relations assesses that the seizure of $300 billion in frozen Russian central bank assets by G7 nations, $205 billion of which are in the European Union, is being touted as a potential funding source for Ukraine. While the United States, Belgium, Czechia, and Estonia have looked into how to use the money within a national context, the G7 debate has lingered due to both international law concerns and fears about Russian retaliation. Nations on the continent are particularly fearful of this potential future, as many think that after the war is over, Russia will make a move on other European countries. Of course, if Russia does become even more aggressive, NATO could potentially play a pivotal role in stopping additional conflicts. That being said, there's still a lot of uncertainty when it comes to exactly how the West would react should Russia declare war on NATO. But things are always more complicated than they seem. One foreseeable issue is Russia's tendency to take risks and miscalculate the consequences of its actions. This makes sense as political science research shows that personalist autocrats like Putin are most inclined to make mistakes, in part because they surround themselves with yes-men and loyalists. As we've seen over the last 2 years, the Kremlin has already seriously underestimated both its ability to rapidly defeat Ukraine's military as well as the West's response to the invasion. Without a doubt, as soon as Russia rebuilds its forces after fighting, many international experts believe that Moscow could reassemble their troops within the next 2 to 5 years, and it could once again pose a very large threat to NATO countries in the East. Although it could be argued that NATO's troops are stronger and better funded than Russia's, much of that'll depend on whether or not the US continues to commit to the alliance and doesn't partake in a major conflict elsewhere. The rest of NATO isn't united either. Last month, French President Macron said he could not rule out the possibility of deploying ground troops to Ukraine in the future. After his controversial remarks, many leaders distanced themselves from him, while others, especially in Eastern Europe, expressed support for Macron in his statement. France's leader urged Europeans not to be weak and get ready to respond. He said it was important for Europe not to draw red lines, which would signal weakness to the Kremlin and encourage Russia to push on with its invasion of Ukraine. He did not, however, provide any additional details on what a deployment to Ukraine might look like or when such an event might happen. But before we can even speculate on what role NATO might play after the war, we should talk about when and how the war might end. There's more than one likely outcome, as well as a variety of potential endings. Total victory or defeat for either Ukraine or Russia cannot be dismissed as a possibility, but they are the least likely outcomes considering how this war has gone so far. Although there are growing concerns about Russia breaking through Ukrainian lines and discussions about Russia gaining control on the ground, Ukrainian perseverance remains strong. If Russia became close to defeating Ukraine, this would most likely drum up additional European and US military support to prevent not only a Ukrainian collapse but also far-reaching damage to Western prestige. To settle the Russo-Ukraine war diplomatically, several analysts have suggested that the apparent military stalemate should be accepted in a ceasefire agreement in which Ukraine would be partitioned along the current battle lines. This would also mean including an agreement that outlines the formal legal acceptance of Russia's annexation of Crimea and of the areas it now controls in southeast Ukraine. Another more plausible possibility would be to leave the issue of formal acceptance open to further negotiation after armed hostilities have ended. So what would Russia do in the event of a ceasefire? There might be more support for peace than expected. After all, even though the government might not admit to it, the Russian public seems to be growing tired of the mobilizations and the duration of the conflict. Certainly, Russians do not want the country to be seen as the losing side, but already today about half of those polled by the Russian non-governmental research organization Levada have consistently supported a ceasefire, including up to one-third of those who say they support the actions of the Russian troops. If Russian forces can no longer appear to make large gains without additional call-ups, pressures could grow on the Kremlin to agree to a negotiated ceasefire. Another possible outcome would be a complete stalemate between the two countries. The front freezes, as it did in Donbass in 2014, and the other post-Soviet wars in Transnistria, South Ossetia, and Abkhazia, in a barren mined landscape with an informal ceasefire that is repeatedly disrupted by shootings and drones from uncontrollable militias of all kinds. No peace, no war. It's as if the area is in a timeout or just frozen in time. This means that neither economies can develop or move forward, nor can they rebuild or recover from the fighting. While all possible scenarios are on the table, 2024 looks like it could be a year of consolidation for both Kyiv and Moscow, as many reports state that Russia lacks the equipment and trained manpower to launch a strategic offensive until spring 2025. If the war does end, whether it's this year or in the next few years, it'll most certainly trigger a realignment of regional powers that would affect not just Europe, but also Asia and Africa. Russia might seek to strengthen alliances with the neighboring countries and exert its influence to shape regional dynamics. This could, in turn, impact geopolitical balances and potentially strain relations with Western powers. Alternatively, the Russo-Ukraine war could be merged into a broader conflict between the US and NATO and Russia and China. A Sino-US military conflict over Taiwan is certainly something that could occur in the next year or two. Such a conflict could happen if Taiwan declares independence and Beijing retaliates militarily, prompting the US to intervene and protect the island. Russia, with China's backing, could then widen the scope of the Ukraine war to include NATO, hoping that the US forces would be overstretched in fighting a war on two fronts thousands of miles apart. While this would be a strain for the US, for Ukraine an escalated conflict might be welcome, unleashing NATO's full force against its invading neighbor. In such a scenario, Moscow's use of tactical nuclear weapons could not be ruled out, especially if Putin's troops get pushed back deep into Russian territory. Though a much smaller country than China, Russia has long had a loyal ally in Belarus. After breaking away from the crumbling Soviet Union in the early 1990s, Belarus became increasingly aligned with Russia. This is a complete contrast to Belarus's neighbors, who have spoken out against the war and Putin. The bonds between Belarus and Russia have strengthened since Putin invaded Ukraine and have continued to grow. Belarus's longtime president Alexander Lukashenko has allowed his country to be used as a staging ground and a base for Russian nuclear weapons while avoiding sending his troops to take part in the war. This is all due in part to the fact that Putin supported Lukashenko's government for many years and came to his aid following a disputed 2020 election that sparked a popular uprising, repression, and sanctions. Africa, too, has also been pulled into the conversation recently, as some wonder how African leaders might have a role in supporting either side of the conflict. Over the past decade, Russia has escalated its presence across Africa, repositioning itself as a burgeoning power in the global race for influence on the continent. For this very reason, it might come as no surprise that Africa has been a third voice in the Russian-Ukrainian war, a conflict that takes place far away from the continent's borders. Recently, Senegal abstained from the UN General Assembly vote to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council and has been known to lean toward Russia in the conflict. However, some say that it's unrealistic to expect the 55 states of Africa to have a common position on a matter of such consequence. After all, Russia has a strong military presence in Africa and has been the biggest arms seller to the continent for over a decade. Right now, many African countries openly support Russia, as it provides maintenance, training, and private military support to the continent. In the past, Russia has supported local communist political parties and military insurgencies and has a close relationship with South Africa's anti-apartheid party, the African National Congress, or the ANC. Look for Russia to continue to do this in the period following the war, as it seems to be in their financial interests. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, as they say. But certainly the war hasn't been great for the whole of the African continent. The war has driven up prices of oil, food, and fertilizers globally, and simulations suggest that a 10% shock in these prices may reduce Africa's annual GDP by $7 billion. Ultimately, what Russia does in the near future will most certainly depend on the outcome of the war. If Russia wins, this will most certainly encourage further aggression by the Kremlin. If Ukraine achieves victory, this could signal the end of Russian dominance in the area. Not only would Russia certainly flex its muscles on the battlefield, but there's also a high likelihood that it would use advanced cyber techniques to assert its power. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence's 2023 Annual Threat Assessment states that Russia will remain a top cyber threat as it refines and employs its espionage, influence, and attack capabilities, and that Russia is particularly focused on improving its ability to target critical infrastructure, including underwater cables and industrial control systems, in the United States as well as in allied and partner countries, because compromising such infrastructure improves and demonstrates its ability to damage infrastructure during a crisis. That same report contends that with 2024 being an election year for America, Moscow will view the coming elections as opportunities to deploy influence operations. Many contend that Russia is contemplating how election outcomes will affect U.S. support for Ukraine, and probably will attempt to affect the elections in ways that best support its interests and goals, the ODNI report notes. Recent Russian state-sponsored activity has included destructive malware and ransomware operations. Prioritizing patching of known exploited vulnerabilities is key to strengthening operational resilience against the threat, as Russia has long looked at using the internet and cyberspace to gain information and political advantage over the West. At this point, we can all agree that if Russia wins, Europe and the world as we know it will completely change. To begin with, a Russian victory would most likely exact terrible victor's justice on the Ukrainians. After all, this is precisely what the Russians have already done in Ukraine: mass executions, castrations, torture, and abductions of children. A discredited NATO would face its biggest test. Then Russia would most likely absorb, if not fully control, any areas of Ukraine and surrounding areas it seizes, thus expanding Russia's military footprint and resource base. NATO and the EU are possibly the strongest remaining multinational alliances in a nationalistic world. Putin would certainly look to prove that they won't hold up against Moscow. If he attacked other areas in Europe, NATO would probably send troops, but how long would this work to deter the Russian forces? Let's look at it this way. Once a few hundred US or NATO soldiers came back dead, international leaders would demand peace, meaning unenforceable peace treaties with Putin. Western countries could theoretically then retreat, saying they met their obligation under the NATO Treaty's Article 5, which stipulates they must fight for an ally. Nobody would want to escalate to nuclear war, something that could very well happen. Additionally, if the war were to end with a Russian victory, Ukraine would be a self-imposed strategic defeat for the US. America and the West would face the risk of a larger and costlier war in Europe. The United States would face the worst threat from Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union, as a victorious Russia would likely emerge reconstituted and more determined to undermine America, and would be confident that it could. A Russian victory would diminish America's deterrence around the world, emboldening others with an explicit or latent intent to harm the United States. Now, on the other hand, if Ukraine wins, the first matter would be a reconstruction of Ukraine itself. The World Bank estimated the cost to be $630 billion. That's not going to come from reparations from a defeated Russia. It'll be a global task of Marshall Plan-like dimensions, which was an American initiative enacted in 1948 to provide foreign aid to Western Europe. The United States transferred $13.3 billion in economic recovery programs to Western European economies after the end of World War II. Additionally, Ukraine would also most likely continue to push for entry into NATO. The alliance's Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, has said it is inevitable that Ukraine will become a member, but not until its war with Russia ends. It's worth noting that before the 2022 offensive, polls indicated that Ukrainians held mixed views on NATO and EU membership. More than half of those surveyed, not including residents of Crimea and the contested regions in the east, supported EU membership, while 40 to 50% were in favor of joining NATO. President Zelensky has asked for Ukraine to be admitted as soon as possible. In September of 2022, he submitted a formal application for Ukraine to join NATO, pushing for an accelerated admission process for that bloc as well. Many Western analysts say that, similar to Ukraine's EU bid, NATO membership will not seem likely in the near term. Turning towards the future and what will transpire throughout the rest of 2024, the Russia-Ukraine war will most probably continue until one side is depleted. The only way to end the war is to defeat Putin, the primary cause of the conflict. However, even a Russian defeat may seem to be a pause, while fighting will only flare up again later. And one major question that still seems to loom large: if Ukraine wins, will Russia accept the outcome? Many believe that in the end, violence, even large-scale violence, would most likely happen again. This has been the case in most frozen conflicts from the Soviet era, including in Georgia's regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which have been de facto integrated into Russia after the latter's military intervention in 2008, and Nagorno-Karabakh, where a 30-year stalemate ended last year when Azerbaijani troops swept into the ethnic Armenian enclave. If this happens, the West would be hard-pressed to return to its original strategy of supporting Ukraine militarily, or they would be faced with having to accept Russia's further advancements and a much worsened security landscape in Europe and beyond, and deal with the fallout of a Ukrainian defeat. Now check out which country is next on Putin's invasion list, or watch this instead.